Well, I'm joined here in the studio by Karim Emile Bitar. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. You're a professor of international relations at Beirut's Saint Joseph University. Just a word of warning, we are waiting to hear from the US President Joe Biden, who's going to give a statement very shortly at the White House, and we'll go to that as soon as he starts speaking. But let's just pick up on what's happening in Lebanon and on the border between Lebanon and Syria. What are your thoughts? How do you interpret Hezbollah's actions, and do you see Lebanon potentially being dragged into this conflict?
There is a genuine risk of a second front on the Lebanese border. So far, Hezbollah has been relatively cautious. They are trying to maintain a degree of separation. So the rockets that were launched were not officially launched by Hezbollah, but rather by the Islamic Jihad, a faction that is part of the same axis. So Hezbollah is trying to maintain plausible deniability so far. The rules of engagement have not totally changed. However, if there is a bloodbath in Gaza in the next few days or in the next few weeks, and if Iran gives the green light, there is a risk that Hezbollah could join and open the second front, which would be absolutely devastating for Lebanon. Lebanon has gone through nightmares in the past few years, economic crisis, the Beirut port blast, an unprecedented rise in poverty. So a new Israel-Lebanon war, Lebanon might simply not be able to recover from it.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding yesterday when we were hearing these conflicting statements from Hezbollah, on the one hand, they seemed to be saying that they had struck targets on the Israeli side of the border, and then they seemed to be saying that actually, no, they didn't. I found these two narratives sort of as if they were trying to talk tough to their domestic audience and trying to sound tough, and then tiptoeing slightly around matters to an international audience. Do you think that's perhaps what they were doing?
Absolutely. I think this is a strategy. You have identified it correctly. They are trying on purpose to maintain this ambiguity, to send a message to Hamas that we stand in solidarity with you, but they are very cautious. Last year, they signed a maritime border demarcation deal with Israel that was engineered by the United States. So they de facto recognized the state of Israel last year. So now it would be it would be a new paradigm shift if Hezbollah has to join this war. But again, I'm afraid it is Iran that has the final word.
Yes, indeed, and Iran's been in denial mode as well today. And I'm just wondering whether perhaps they're being careful in Iran, because they know, and I don't know if social media images and videos are to be fully relied upon in these situations, but domestically things do seem fragile in Iran. We've seen things blow up in Iran in the last 12 months to an extent that the authorities seem to be managing to contain things. And it does seem to be the case that there is zero appetite in Iran for this type of a conflict.
Yes, absolutely. I would say that over 70% of the Iranian population is radically hostile to the regime, particularly the youth. Iran is one of the most secularized society, paradoxically, in the entire Muslim world. And I think this is also one of the reasons why Secretary Blinken said that so far there are no proofs, there is no smoking gun regarding an Iran taking part in preparing these attacks. So I think Iran is trying to be cautious, and the United States is trying to prevent an Iranian escalation.
But of course, Iran not condemning those attacks by Hamas by any stretch of the imagination. They seem to applaud them today, saying they'd kiss the hands of the people responsible. And obviously they didn't want to see that deal go through, the normalization of ties between Saudi and Israel. Why not?
Because the ongoing rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia that dates back to 1979 is still very much in their minds. Even though they signed a Beijing brokered agreement a few months ago, they are still very reluctant to see their Saudi nemesis normalize relations with Israel.
But things have improved a little bit, haven't they, in recent months? We've got that impression.
Indeed. We have a certain degree of de-escalation. It's a a détente, but it's not yet an entente. It has not given serious results in Yemen or in Lebanon. But the fact is, Iran is increasingly influential in the Middle East, and this started when the US invaded Iraq in 2003. Paradoxically, it allowed Iran to become the leading regional power and to extend its reach to the Mediterranean Sea.
And let's talk about Israel's response. There are 100 hostages, maybe 150 hostages inside Gaza right now. That doesn't seem to have represented the same barrier that we might have imagined it would represent to how Israel responded. I mean, it doesn't seem, does it, to have changed the Israeli response. They've gone ahead anyway, despite the threat of what might happen to those hostages with a massive aerial bombardment.
I think the trauma in Israel is really unprecedented. They rarely have had so many people killed and slaughtered in less than 72 hours. So the Israeli public is probably expecting an extremely devastating response. The problem is, in the past 3 or 4 decades, every one of these counterattacks, quote unquote, proved to be extremely counterproductive, and it led to the emergence of movements that were even more radical than the movements that Israel was initially fighting. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, they managed to eradicate Fatah, but soon after, Hezbollah emerged, which is a much more powerful enemy. So the only iron law in Middle East politics is the law of unintended consequences. So Israel has to be extremely cautious, because if it proceeds with a ground operation in Gaza, it would not only inflame the feeling of solidarity towards Palestinians throughout the world, but it could very well also prove to be counterproductive even for the current Israeli radical government.
Israel's got some new friends since the last time it found itself in a situation as difficult as this. And I'm talking about friends in the Arab world, countries like the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, potentially Saudi in the background. Qatar seems to be playing a productive role as well, even though they haven't normalized ties. What can they bring to the table, these new friends? And do you think Israel's listening to them?
Well, when we mention those new friends, we need to mention an important caveat. Israel is getting closer to the leaders of this country, is getting closer to the Gulf monarchs. But when you look at public opinion in the Gulf, including in Saudi Arabia, public opinion is still very much in solidarity with the Palestinians. So it will be increasingly difficult for these governments to continue the normalization process with Israel, because even though they are not democracies, there is a feeling, they know that their public opinion is not on board. And a turning point was the World Cup soccer that happened in Qatar, when the Moroccan players started winning and raised the Palestinian flags in the stadiums. I think they all realized that they had to slow down this normalization process.
Yeah, and do you think if Israel's too harsh in Gaza, I mean, if it's perceived in the Arab world that perhaps they've gone beyond what would be, by anybody's standards, a reasonable response, could those relationships be in jeopardy? Could they be in peril?
Yes, they would be in jeopardy. There is still, across the Arab world and across the Muslim world, a very intense solidarity with the Palestinians. People do not understand why there is such a huge mobilization for Ukraine when Ukraine is illegally invaded and occupied. And they think that because Palestinians are not blonde and blue-eyed, they can suffer for decades under occupation, and the West simply does not care. So this sense of being completely dispossessed and disempowered will only lead to further radicalization if we do not see superpowers, United States, France, European Union, and others put finally some pressure on Israel after decades of blind and unconditional support. If Israel realizes that occupation has a price in terms of its image, but also economically, it is still getting $4 billion a year from the United States. So the United States does have leverage, but it's not using it.
Okay, well, I've been seeing some movement at the White House, which makes me think that Joe Biden might be about to come round the corner. We'll take a chance. Let me ask you this question, putting you on the spot slightly, Professor. How do we make sure that Saturday's events are never again repeated?
only by changing the complete logic that has been so pervasive in the past decades. The global war on terror worldwide has provoked much more victims than terrorism itself. And if Israel launches a massive retaliation in Gaza, we can expect thousands of civilian victims. So the rationale behind the global war on terror is deeply flawed. After 9/11, the United States declared this global war on terror. 20 years later, we have paid dozens of billions of dollars, and yet terrorism has only been much more widespread and is now present in dozens of countries. It's no longer isolated in Tora Bora in Afghanistan.
And a country like Qatar playing this role that it's playing, trying to negotiate the freedom of some of the hostages, we understand, very much in the background. Do they have much sway over Hamas?
Absolutely. They do have a lot of sway over Hamas. They have supported Hamas financially in the past. Qatar could play a significant role. However, I'm not sure the Israelis are ready. They want their hostages out, but I'm not sure they are ready to make further concessions. And even Saudi Arabia had demanded a series of conditions before accepting normalization.
Professor, let me cut you short. The US president is speaking. Let's cross to the White House.
I mean this literally, when the pure, unadulterated evil is unleashed on this world. The people of Israel lived through one such moment this weekend. The bloody hands of the terrorist organization Hamas, a group whose stated purpose for being is to kill Jews. This was an act of sheer evil. More than 1,000 civilians slaughtered, not just killed, slaughtered in Israel. Among them, at least 14 American citizens killed. Parents butchered using their bodies to try to protect their children. Stomach-turning reports of babies being killed. Entire families slain. Young people massacred while attending a musical festival to celebrate peace. To celebrate peace. Women raped, assaulted, paraded as trophies. Families hid their fear for hours and hours, desperately trying to keep their children quiet to avoid drawing attention. And thousands of wounded, alive but carrying with them the bullet holes and the shrapnel wounds and the memory of what they endured. You all know these traumas never go away. There's still so many families desperately waiting to hear the fate of their loved ones, not knowing if they're alive or dead or hostages. Infants in their mother's arms, grandparents in wheelchairs, Holocaust survivors abducted and held hostage. Hostages whom Hamas has now threatened to execute in violation of every code of human morality. It's abhorrent. The brutality of Hamas, these bloodthirstiness brings to mind the worst rampages of ISIS. This is terrorism. But sadly, for the Jewish people, it's not new. This attack has brought to the surface painful memories and the scars left by a millennia of anti-Semitism and genocide of the Jewish people. So in this moment, we must be crystal clear. We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel. And we will make sure Israel has what it needs to take care of its citizens, defend itself, and respond to this attack. There's no justification for terrorism. There's no excuse. Hamas does not stand for the Palestinian people's right to dignity and self-determination. Its stated purpose is the annihilation of the state of Israel and the murder of Jewish people. They use Palestinian civilians as human shields. Hamas offers nothing but terror and bloodshed with no regard to who pays the price. The loss of innocent life is heartbreaking. Like every nation in the world, Israel has the right to respond, indeed has a duty to respond to these vicious attacks. I just got off the phone with the third call with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I told him The United States experience what Israel is experiencing, our response will be swift, decisive, and overwhelming. We also discussed how democracies like Israel and the United States are stronger and more secure when we act according to the rule of law. Terrorists purposely target civilians, kill them. We uphold the laws of war, the law of war. It matters. There's a difference. Today, Americans across the country are praying for all those families that have been ripped apart. A lot of us know how it feels. It leaves a black hole in your chest when you lose family. Feeling like you're being sucked in. The anger, the pain, the sense of hopelessness. This is what they mean by a human tragedy, an atrocity on an appalling scale. We're going to continue to stand united, supporting the people of Israel who are suffering unspeakable losses and opposing the hatred and violence of terrorism. My team has been in near constant communication with our Israeli partners and partners all across the region and the world from the moment this crisis began. We're surging additional military assistance, including ammunition and interceptors, to replenish Iron Dome. We're going to make sure that Israel does not run out of these critical assets to defend its cities and its citizens. My administration has consulted closely with Congress throughout this crisis. And when Congress returns, we're going to ask them to take urgent action to fund the national security requirements of our critical partners. This is not about party or politics. This is about the security of our world, the security of the United States of America. We now know that American citizens are among those being held by Hamas. I've directed my team to share intelligence and deploy additional experts from across the United States government to consult with and advise Israeli counterparts on hostage recovery efforts. Because as president, I have no higher priority than the safety of Americans being held hostage around the world. The United States has also enhanced our military force posture in the region to strengthen our deterrence. The Department of Defense has moved the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group to the Eastern Mediterranean and bolstered our fighter aircraft presence. And we stand ready to move in additional assets as needed. Let me say again, to any country, any organization, anyone thinking of taking advantage of this situation, I have one word: don't. Don't. Our hearts may be broken, but our resolve is clear. Yesterday, I also spoke with the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, and UK to discuss the latest developments with our European allies and coordinate our united response. This comes on top of days of steady engagement with partners across the region. We're also taking steps at home. In cities across the United States of America, police departments have stepped up security around centers of Jewish life. The Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Bureau of Investigation are working closely with state and local law enforcement and Jewish community partners to identify and disrupt any domestic threat that could emerge in connection with these horrific attacks. This is a moment for the United States to come together, to grieve with those who are mourning. Let's be real clear. There is no place for hate in America. Not against Jews, not against Muslims, not against anybody. We reject. What we reject is terrorism. We condemn the indiscriminate evil, just as we've always done. That's what America stands for. You know, just over 50 years ago, I was thinking about it this morning, talking to the Secretary of State, the Vice President in my office. Over 50 years ago, as a young senator, I visited Israel for the first time as a newly elected senator. And I had a long, long trip, a meeting with Golda Meir in her office. just before the Yom Kippur War. And I guess she could see the consternation on my face as she described what was being faced. They were facing. We walked outside in that sort of hallway outside her office to have some photos. She looked at me all of a sudden and said, "Would you like to have a photograph?" And so I got up and followed her out. We were standing there silent, looking at the press. She could tell, I guess, I was concerned. She leaned over and whispered to me, she said, "Don't worry, Senator Biden. We have a secret rep in here in Israel." My word is what she said. We have no place else to go. We have no place else to go. For 75 years, Israel has stood as the ultimate guarantor of the security of Jewish people around the world, so that the atrocities of the past could never happen again. And let there be no doubt, the United States has Israel's back. We will make sure the Jewish and democratic state of Israel can defend itself today, tomorrow, as we always have. It's as simple as that. These atrocities have been sickening. We're with Israel. Let's make no mistake. Thank you.
Mr. President, what was your reaction?
Okay, we're just listening there to the US President Joe Biden speaking at the White House with his vice president at his side. We stand with Israel, he says, as he reiterated his condemnation of Hamas for their deadly weekend attacks on Israeli soil. He called those attacks an act of sheer evil. He also talked about the American hostages being held by Hamas and said that 14 Americans believed to have been killed.